Annie Polland is the Vice President for Programs and Education at the Lower East Side Tenement Side Museum, where she oversees exhibits and interpretation. She is the author with Daniel Sawyer of Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, winner of the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. She received her PhD in history from Columbia University and also served as Vice President of Education at the museum at Eldridge Street, where she wrote Landmark of the Spirit, the Eldridge Street Synagogue, published by Yale University Press in 2008. She also teaches at New York University. And her talk is titled From Immigrant Era Cookbooks to Contemporary Walking Tours, Jewish Food on the Lower East Side.
Thank you so much, and buongiorno. And thank you, Simone and Hasia, for inviting me to this wonderful conference. It's so wonderful, and it's so wonderful to be here that I really don't want to go back. And it's even hard for me to talk about New York right now. But I'm going to do that. I work at a museum, and the museum is based on New York's Lower East Side, which has historically been, and continues to be to some degree, a neighborhood where new immigrants arrive, and they create new communities in this space while also becoming part of New York City, and in turn shaping New York City. And what we do at our museum is we tell that story of immigration through this building. This is a tenement, and there are many of them on New York's Lower East Side, and in fact many throughout New York. They were built in the last third of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century to house all of these working class immigrants who were arriving in New York in such large numbers. And so most people, when the museum was started in the 1980s, thought, including Hasia Diner, it thought that the idea for this museum was crazy. Why would you take a tenement and use this vernacular, this ordinary building, and tell stories? How could that be a museum? But the founders of the museum really believed strongly that social history was an important story to tell, and that by tracing the people who actually lived in that building, you could be telling really powerful stories about immigration to people from all over the world. And indeed, today, in New York, at the Tenement Museum, we see about 210,000 visitors a year, and we could see more. We turn people away because we just can't fit that many people in the building at one time. And the way that we tell the story is different from a lot of other museums. In a lot of other museums, you walk through a museum and you see wall text, and you read, and you look at a painting, or you look at a diorama, or you look at an exhibit. What we do here is we have educators lead people in small groups through the building, telling the stories of the families who actually lived in the building. So between 1863 and 1935, when the building closed to residents, we've counted over 7,000 people who lived in the building, not at the same time, but over time. And almost everyone who lived there, the parents were immigrants, and their children were immigrants, or they were obviously the children of immigrants. And they were in the early years, from Germany, a little bit from Ireland, and then by the 1880s you start to see a significant Jewish population. By the 19-teens you start to see Italians arrive, and also I should mention it wasn't just East European Jews who were arriving, but Sephardic Jews as well, and we'll hear more about them in the papers today. But I want to I'm going to start with a little story. And when I started working at the Tenement Museum about 5 years ago, I remember talking to one of our educators who had come back from a tour, and he was just deflated. He had thought he had led this excellent tour. And when you lead a tour, it's a lot of work, because you're telling the history, you're telling the stories of the people who lived in the buildings. You take them inside, and you have to make the story tell a building. You have to make the building rather tell a story. And you work with people's questions, and you try to be interactive, and it just takes a lot of work. But he came back, and he had thought he had given a really great tour, and this man came up to him at the end, and the man was beaming, and he just was, he kind of slapped him on the back, and he said, son, that was great. Now can you tell me where Katz's Deli is? And Katz's Deli is just a deli that's a few blocks away that's become very, very famous. And to kind of make it make sense here, it would be kind of as if you had your family visit you for the first time at this beautiful place where slow food is valorized, and this is what you've devoted your life to. And your parents come, or your family, your friends come, and they take a little tour. You try to explain to them what you're learning in these classrooms, and they said, that's great, where's the closest McDonald's? Right? So that was kind of the way that this was greeted when we would hear this. And it wasn't just that one time. People would come on a tour and then they want to get straight over to get food. And we thought that was terrible, right? How could they just run off and go get food? And I think when we probed this, because I think anytime you get upset with a visitor, you really are, it's really an opportunity to think about what you're doing wrong as a teacher in a way. And so we stepped back and we said, why are we so upset about people running off to eat? And what emerged was that people felt badly, that here they are telling the story of these immigrant working class people, and the tourists then come and they run off to get food, and they're eating food that's divorced from a historical context. So then we realized, oh, well, that's our fault, right? This is an opportunity to be using food to teach people about history and to do a better job of that. And so we kind of resolved to kind of fix this and to think about how food can be used as a window on the lives of the people who lived in that building. One small problem is that we can't allow food in the historic building. So even though, this was a building that would have been filled with the smells of various cookings, various cuisines at all times of day, we can't bring the food in because it's a historic building, because of vermin, all sorts of problems. In fact, right now in New York, my curator is probably freaking out because he's sensing me talk about food in the building. It's just such a taboo subject, and we have to make sure all visitors, rid themselves of all food, gum, candy, nothing can get in the building. So if that's the case, how can we teach about food if we can't have people taste? But we decided we could do that. But we also decided to create another set of programs outside of the historic building through walking tours and in another building that we own where people could actually taste the foods of different cultures. So I'm going to walk you through a few of these programs today to give you a sense of what stories we've been able to tell about food and how, in fact, food has led us to illuminate aspects of the residents' lives, the immigrants' lives of that building that we would not otherwise be able to tell. And I think one of the things I should say off the bat too is that it's provided a wonderful window onto the lives of women, and it's also been another window on the diversity of the immigrant experience in general. So this is the hallway of the building, and this is a hallway that would have been filled with people going in and out at all times of day. And this is one of the apartments. This is one of the kitchens of the apartments we've created. It's the kitchen of Fanny and Abraham Rogaszewski, who came from Lithuania in 1901. They moved in the building around 1907. They raised 6 children in an apartment that's about 325 square feet. I think that's like 32 meters, thank you, square meters. So a very small space. And that was a place where we kind of had to imagine Fanny, like at the oven. What was she doing? What was she thinking about? And in some ways, the history written about immigrant women doesn't necessarily give us a lot to work with. I mean, there are many things to work with, but there's a kind of imbalance in the sense that this is just to kind of illustrate this. And I'm speaking in very general terms, but this is a picture from a book called Spirit of the Ghetto from 1902, Hutchins Hapgood, who was a progressive era journalist. And he had an artist, Jacob Epstein, who lived on the Lower East Side, sketch people. So there's all sorts of sketches of the people on the Lower East Side. And this is one of the daughters, the immigrant daughters. So these could be Bessie or Ida Rogaszewski, the daughters of Fanny. And you can see they're out in the street, they're on their way to work, or they're returning home from work. They're buying food out. They're moving, or actually they might have been bringing food with them, they're bringing packages with them, but you see them very much part of the cityscape, very much in motion. Here are the mothers. So this is a picture of a woman with the traditional head covering, and she's going to, it says, the rabbi can tell whether or not it is kosher. So she's bringing a bird to see, for the rabbi to check whether or not it's kosher or not. And this shows women in the traditional role of observing the laws of kashrut. It also shows women, I think, deferring to the authority of the rabbi, to Jewish law. But it doesn't, to my mind, it's a part of life, but it didn't give that much of a window onto Fanny Rogoshevsky. And what was the action? What was the action of the women in kind of running those kitchens? Fanny Rogoshevsky was someone who was the family's accountant, in the sense that her husband worked for wages, her older children worked for wages. She would be gathering those wages and would become the kind of the accountant of the family. If in bad times they needed to take on a boarder, then in that small space, it would be up to her to go find someone to rent that space out so she could get a little extra money. And so she could do some cleaning, laundry for him, maybe prepare food for him, and be able to help with the whole family economy. In many ways, the immigrant mothers were running the family economy of the home, the household economy. And that involved an array of decisions. So those pictures where you see the daughters in action, but the mothers kind of deferring to the rabbi, didn't give us the full picture. And we had another opportunity we were beginning in 2011 to create a new exhibit that would tell the story of the stores. All of these tenements that were built not only had the residential apartments above, but all were built with storefronts, and so there were stores on the bottom. And we traced over 30 stores that were in this building, many of them involving food. One, a German immigrant tavern or saloon that was there. And another one that we found that was really exciting was a kosher butcher store that was there. So this is the Lustgardens. This is the family that ran the kosher butcher store that was in 97A Orchard Street. They came from Stanislaus around 1881. There are different dates for their arrival depending on which document you look at, but around sometime in the early 1880s, they came with 4 children and then had 2 more children in New York. This is them posed outside of a butcher store they had on Broome Street. We believe it's the late 1880s, judging on the ages of the children, but you have Israel Lustgarten, the father on the left, and the mother Goldie Lustgarten on my left, and then 5 of their 6 children. And they ran a kosher butcher store from 1889 to 1902, right out of 97 Orchard Street. And this picture is really helpful, too, because it helps us question our sources. The census record for 1900, there's a column for occupation. And after Israel's name, it says butcher. After Goldie's name, anyone want to guess what it says for her occupation? Housewife. It actually has nothing there. But in other cases it says housewife, that depending on the year, but it has nothing there. So what our educator would say to you if you were on a tour of the building, do you think Goldie did nothing? And it's impossible to think of Goldie doing nothing, especially when you see her in this picture. One thing that struck us about this picture is, yes, Israel's the one listed on the census as the shopkeeper, but you can see here that everyone in the picture, including 5-year-old William, is wearing an apron. An indication that they are indeed working in the butcher shop. So this is a kind of the family endeavor. And again, we see a much more complicated picture. This is not just the line drawing of the woman going to the rabbi to check if something is kosher, but she is running an establishment. And it's an establishment that's pretty successful if it's been there at least between 1889 and 1902, and they ran a business beforehand on another store. So they're doing something well in this context. What this is a map of Orchard Street. Just of Orchard Street, it's about 6 blocks, and every red square that you see is actually a kosher butcher store. So you can see how many kosher butcher stores there were. In all of the Lower East Side, there were about 131 in 1899, and here there's about 27, I believe. So they were not the only people selling kosher meat, but this is a wonderful kind of reminder, I think, of why people immigrated to America in the first place. People were leaving Europe because they weren't able to provide for their families. That was one of the main reasons that they were leaving, in addition to discrimination and persecution. But on a very day-to-day level, they could not serve their families meat. And you come to New York, and conditions are poor, and they're living in tenements, and they're working in sweatshops, but they're serving meat. So something is happening, something in America overall. There's an overall, and that doesn't mean everyone's going up, but in general there is a kind of improvement in nutrition and the kind of food that you're able to access. So this it's a blurry picture and it's hard to see, but it's taken from the New York World in May 17th, 1902, and what you see is 97A Orchard Street. Meat market wrecked by rioters. This is our friends. This is their store, and it's been attacked. So what happened? In May of 1902, the price of kosher meat escalated from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. And the immigrant women in the neighborhood were furious because what this meant was they could no longer put meat on the table. And you might say, why didn't they serve fish? Why didn't they serve eggs? Well, as soon as the price of meat went up, the fishmongers raised their prices and the eggs raised their prices. So these women, this was kind of in many ways the straw that broke the camel's back because they could no longer kind of do what they were doing. They could no longer do their job, and their job was to somehow shop and to feed their families, and that was over at this point. So they started to organize, and they went from stoop to stoop. The immigrant women, speaking in Yiddish to their neighbors, come with me, let's, don't buy meat, don't buy meat. And they would rent halls, and they would rent clubs, and they would speak. And they put out ads in the Yiddish newspapers as well. And they started this movement to stop, to not buy meat. And when they're doing this, they're drawing on tradition. Right? Because they're saying they want to have kosher meat. They could have gone and bought non-kosher meat, but they said no, they want to have affordable kosher meat. But they want it to be affordable. So as much as they're fighting for their traditional foodways, they're using very modern and very innovative ways of shaping those demands. They're borrowing from the labor movement. The wonderful historian of blessed memory, Paula Hyman, has written a wonderful article that brought all of this into the kind of historiography. So we could kind of see this role that women had using their consumer power. And you can see this is a cartoon called Housewives Fight, well, we called it Housewives Fight Back, but it's Die Macht von Frauen, the might of the women, or the power of the women, and you could see the women who were fighting against the trust, the meat trust that had raised the prices. Yet, so this is this wonderful lens on this moment of history, again, seeing how actively, we've used the word negotiation a lot today, what you're seeing is how women are actively negotiating this new situation. They're fighting for their right to have traditional kosher meat, but they're employing new means. They would check the cholent pots, and cholent is a kind of stew, to make sure that there was no meat in their neighbor's cholent pot. So they were kind of policing one another. If they saw someone go into a kosher meat store and buy meat, they called that person a scab, which was the term for a strike breaker, which is like the worst thing you could call someone in those times. They're giving speeches on the street, so they're borrowing in many ways from a lot of the practices of the labor movement that was current in their neighborhoods at the time. Now, so there's this wonderful story, and when I read this article in graduate school, and when I used it at various points, I've always kind of championed the perspective of the women. Like, this is just this amazing thing that they did. They were successful. They ended up bringing, through their pressure and through the other people joined on, bringing the price of meat back down to 14 cents. So I was always on the women's side. But in creating this exhibit, it forced me to take the side of Israel and Goldie Lustgarten, and it's hard to see in this photo, but we have a higher res photo, but actually in the higher res photo, you can see the outline of a bearded man behind that broken glass, which might have been Israel Lustgarten. What was it like to be Israel or Goldie Lustgarten and be behind that broken glass? What was the perspective of the retail butchers? The retail butchers did not want to raise the prices in the first place. It was the wholesalers that had raised the prices. And retail butchers, like Israel Lustgarten, had boycotted at first the wholesale butchers. But in the end, they had to give in because they had to run a business. They had to pay rent. No one was giving them a break. And so they ended up opening with the higher priced meat. So the question is, why did the immigrant women attack the retail butchers and not the wholesalers? And that has to do with the power of the women and the limits of the power of the women. So that power of the women, the wholesalers were located in the West and the East 40s. So these Yiddish-speaking immigrant women would have had no power if they went up and marched, for example, on East 42nd Street. That would not have made any difference. The only power that they had was in their neighborhoods. So they boycotted the butchers in their neighborhoods, and they also, in certain moments, turned violent. And they threw bricks, they threw cabbages, they threw onions, and broke the windows of the butchers. Mm-hmm. Right here?
No, the one before, with the women.
Yeah, Die Macht von Frauen, the might or the power of the women. So that power was circumscribed by the neighborhood that they were in. And to kind of then now think about the perspective of the Lustgardens, you have a different kind of situation because these butchers might have been serving meat to their neighbors for 15 years, for 12 years, and now they're being attacked, right? And what was it like to be in that store when that brick came crashing through the glass? We know reports from other butchers, newspapers paid a lot of attention to what was going on, that they fled to the back rooms. I should add that the Lustgardens just lived right behind their store. So they would have just gone, right, to their rooms, which were right behind the butcher store, and locked the door and waited till the kind of the chaos dissipated a little bit or moved on. And I think also thinking about the perspective of Goldie is particularly illuminating. So in this event, she's on opposite sides of the protest as the housewives who are protesting. And many, through the longue durée, through the whole time that they're there at that space, she's been on an opposite side of a counter serving them. But in most respects, they're very similar. Paula Hyman found that the mean age of the boycott leaders who could be traced was 39. They had about 4.3 children living at home, had been in New York from anywhere from 3 to 27 years with a mean average of 11 years. Goldie Lustgarten had been in America 20 years, was the mother of 6 children, and was also about 40 years old. In addition to sharing characteristics of the boycott leaders, she shared much in common with the residents of 97 Orchard. Married women, even if whether they helped run a family business or not, were in charge, as I mentioned earlier, of the household. And so she would have had a lot in common in terms of tending to the borders, managing the home. We know that in New York, in general, 56% of Jewish immigrant housewives had at least one boarder. At 97 Orchard, in 1900, when Goldie was there, 10 out of the 20 households had boarders. Goldie Lustgarten was one of them. So she was someone that, just like her neighbors, was faced with the same situation of having to create a family economy, having to make do, having to kind of figure out how to negotiate all of this work and negotiate the market. And the women had pride in this work. That was one of the things that was found in the newspapers. And one newspaper, an American newspaper, kind of reflected on the strike when it was over. It has been a women's strike throughout, and its efficiency shows what power lies in the hands of the administrator of the family funds. Men buy for themselves, women buy for the family, is the old trade axiom, which has received salient illustration in this boycott. And they also said that the experiments that these women were doing, interestingly enough, is one that should become current among, quote, American housewives and may prove of value to them. So there was really a kind of saying that this consumer power that these immigrant women were evidencing through this boycott might serve as an example to other women throughout the country. When Paula Hyman concluded her article, she talked a lot about the legacy of this boycott and the legacy of this kind of radicalism that erupted over these few weeks in May and June of 1902 as one being for the daughters. She said that the daughters kind of saw this activism, and the daughters were then were then able to take this activism into the garment industry, where they were very instrumental in organizing and striking and fighting for a lot of change. But I think the broader point is it's more helpful to use the kosher meat boycott to kind of underline and to bring into relief the role that women had as the administrator of the food, as the administrator of the household economy, and the power that they had then. It sets into relief their engagement in this economy, the running of the household, and also their innovative adaptation. Now, another way we can look at this innovative adaptation is to look at cookbooks from the time. And this cookbook, the reason the museum found this story was kind of a side story, but interesting. A woman named Hinda Amchanitsky in 1901 published what's known as the first Yiddish cookbook in America. And in 2011, a headstone, this gravestone, was found in this artist's basement. Or it was found on a sidewalk, and then it was traced to someone's basement. And this was her headstone, but no one knew who she was, and certainly this man who found it had no idea what this was. And he brought it to Sam Roberts, an important reporter at the New York Times, and together they kind of figured out the story of this. They traced it they found out that she was the author of a cookbook, that her cookbook actually is in the Library of Congress, and it's on display, or in the same display, I believe, as Benjamin Franklin's recipe for ice cream. So you have this woman kind of in the same setting from writing this Yiddish cookbook. They trace her, and they actually found where the grave was supposed to be. It was missing. It's unclear why the grave went missing, what happened to the tombstone. Maybe the family didn't pay for it. It's unclear, but there it was, and then it was returned, and she died. But we wanted to explore more this cookbook, and you can see, and people have written about it, but we wanted to kind of get more into the story. So it's called Lehrbuch wie Zeug zu kochen und backen. It's like a manual for how to cook and bake, originally published by a Yiddish woman who has 45 years of experience in European and American kitchens. And the price then in 1901 was 15 cents. It was available at different bookstores. And just even looking at the kind of the foreword that she writes, she promises that her cooking is going to be economical, so you can afford it. She promises that she has experience in cooking in all of these kitchens throughout Europe, actually, and America. She herself runs a restaurant. She's a female entrepreneur, just like Goldie Lustgarten, in fact. And she also promises that the recipes are wonderful and they won't cause dyspepsia in children, so that this was a kind of a safe, a healthy kind of thing for them. The index lists a number of different recipes, and there's like goulash, there's all sorts of different recipes, steak. There are things, basically all different kinds of soups, but there's also things that some of these are traditional European Jewish foods, but what she's also doing is adding new things to them. For example, there's chicken soup mit macaroni. So there's a kind of adding macaroni to chicken soup as part of running a Jewish household now. And there's a whole section on pies. So the idea was, and at the same time, the cookbook was hewed to kashrut. It was, it's still, none of the recipes called for any violation of the Jewish laws. There's also a special section for Passover foods. So at the same time that she's embracing this very American passion for pies and all the different kinds of pies, she's also showing the importance of keeping the different holidays. So there's a lot to be said about this cookbook, and people have written about it, and in Hasia Diner's wonderful book, Hungering for America, she's written about it as well. But when I started looking into it more, I found a little bit of a mystery in that the library had an edition it was called the third edition. There was no mention of a second edition, but somehow there was a third edition. And it said that it was 1902 ? So they guessed, they didn't know the publication date, but they guessed it was sometime in the 1920s. This is a little bit of a problem, because if you were paying attention to the tombstone earlier, you might have noticed that she died in 1910. So how is there a cookbook in 1920? It's still under her name and nothing in it, so we have nowhere to go but to look at the text itself. And what is different, a lot is the same, but what was interesting to me right from the beginning is that it continued to say that she has 45 years of experience in America. She had 45 years of experience of cooking in 1901. If this is published later, why doesn't it say 55 years? And you could argue that it was the typeset, that it was too expensive to change that, but they were already making all sorts of other changes. So this is kind of this new updated thing. In addition, there are improvements to the cookbook in the sense that there's now a section on vegetables and vegetarian cooking. There's a section on keeping a clean home. There's a section even on keeping a kosher home. So what's going on here? There are a few changes in the foreword as well. But the best clue, in a way, was to kind of look at how it was written, and the tone in many ways. So one thing is that the tone was a very different tone than the tone before. Before, when the cookbook was written, it was simply the recipe. It was like, "Dear sisters, this is for you, dear sisters," a very kind of informal tone. The new tone, when you get to the second improvements with the vegetable stuff, is almost in a lecturing tone, like, "Jewish women, you're not doing enough with vegetables," and blah, 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 and very kind of very didactic in a way. So my guess is that this was not written by Hinda Amchanitsky, but someone thought that that the cookbook was the way to get through this new ideology of vegetarianism that they thought was important to do. It was also important to get this new ideology of, not new ideology, but it was important to remind people how to keep kosher. In 1901, they didn't need to know necessarily, but now someone in the 19-teens or 1920s is saying, Jewish women don't know enough about how to keep kosher, so they need to have this part of the manual. Regardless, what was really important is that it was a cookbook. The cookbook was the way they were going to get these ideas across. And so you see the importance of these kind of cookbooks, not just for the food, but for all of these kinds of new ideas that people think, leaders and newspaper editors also and advice givers think that it's important for women to use. At the end of the day, though, women are selecting from a variety of cookbooks, and they're selecting from a variety of recipes and advice books that are available. So it's the women who are kind of, at the end of the day, negotiating all of this change. So kind of looking at food is this wonderful lens to kind of look at these pretty complicated adaptations. The fact that you have one cookbook in 1901 saying one thing, and you have a cookbook maybe 15 years later, perhaps not saying something totally different, but with new things, is also a reminder that what it means to be American or what it means to negotiate is always changing, and that context for these immigrant women is always changing, and that's what they're responsible for. Before we end, I want to jump to also how we are using food to teach food history. And this is just a picture from one of our food walking tours in which people go on tours of the Lower East Side and they learn about the food experiences of the Germans, the Italians, and the Jews, as well as new immigrant groups like the Dominicans and the Chinese that live on the Lower East Side. And throughout, very much of the kind of thesis of this tour, if you will, is taken very much from Hasia Diner's work, Hungering for America, speaking about how the immigrants did not bring their recipes wholesale and totally recreate what they were doing. It's a mix and it's a blend. And all of these cultures, whether it was the Italian or the German or the Jews or the Dominicans or the Chinese, show this blending of culture. Just one example, the Nessus Dumpling House, which is located just 2 blocks from the museum, serves dumplings. And it's run by a woman entrepreneur, in some ways the modern day Hinda Amchanitsky, a woman named Vanessa who speaks Mandarin, who is selling these dumplings, but is selling them to a very American market. She has sesame pancakes, which are more of a Chinese food, but inside of them is tuna fish or ham and cheese. So you see the way that the food is representing this blending and the changing of cultures. And there are many examples there. And finally, we are now working with children. In New York City, almost all the students, or over half of the students in New York City public schools are immigrants. And what we're doing with these students is after they come to the museum and they learn about immigrants from 100 years ago or 50 years ago, they go home and they talk to their parents and they learn about foodways that they have brought over. And so this is one Palestinian recipe for a pastry that a girl wrote about, and then they write essays about them as well. And this is a platine made to use roti. So when these students are coming, again, they're not learning just about what happened a century ago. They're learning about how their own families are part of this much more broader immigrant narrative, one in which food is a way to kind of be bringing traditions over, but food is also a way to let them adapt.